Dr. Richard Blath was a 1968 Miami graduate, a veteran, and a father. But before all of that, he was the same as everyone else, just a baby. Baby Richard was born on July 2nd, 1946, one of the first baby boomers. Most kids wanted to be astronauts or football players, but ever since the day he could talk, Blath knew he wanted to be a doctor, and he was more than ready for the work that came with that. Instead of focusing his time on hanging out with the cool kids at school, he instead decided to graduate in the top 10 in his class. Although he got accepted into Yale, realistically he had to go with something that him and his family could afford. And after discovering Miami's great pre-med program in 1964, he knew that being a Redskin was his life path. Little did he know that at Miami he would meet someone who would change his life forever. Lorraine and him fell in love immediately and dated all throughout college. Between Lori and being on board for his all-Jewish fraternity, it's especially impressive that he finished Miami's pre-med program summa cum laude in just 3 years, a feat no one else from Miami has been able to accomplish to this day. After Miami, it was time for him to continue his pursuit of becoming a doctor and go to med school, but not before marrying his college sweetheart. They were married in 1968 and moved back to St. Louis together so Richard could do his studies at Washington University. 4 years later, the two of them went to Vanderbilt to begin his residency to becoming a surgeon, only for the three of them to come back to St. Louis 2 years later to end his training. Yes, you heard right. While living in Tennessee at Vanderbilt, Richard and Lori had their firstborn child, Lisa, and their fourth son, Jeffrey, wasn't long behind. The four of them lived a cozy life in St. Louis while Richard was finishing his residency at Washington University until 1976, when it was time for him to fulfill his duty to his country and join the Air Force. Let's rewind a bit. In 1969, Richard was 2 years into his studies at Washington University's medical school. This year was also the year that the U.S. government began to draft for the war in Vietnam, and Richard was a prime specimen. However, because he was preparing to be a doctor, they let him finish out his training before he had to do his service. 10 years later, even though the war was over, he still had to pay his debt to his country. Him, Lori, Lisa, and Jeff moved to an Air Force base in Dayton, Ohio. After giving 2 years of his life to the Air Force, and after the 12 years of schooling and training, he was finally able to practice being a doctor freely. They moved back to what they knew, and Richard found a urology practice with 3 other urologists in the St. Louis area. After spending his entire life moving, him and his family decided it was time to stay put for a while. They spent the next 40 years in St. Louis, but they must have not liked it too much because their favorite thing to do was leave. They made it their mission to travel the world, and that mission did they accomplish. Now it's 2016, and Dr. Richard Blath is still residing in that same home they moved to from Dayton in 1978, still married to his Miami merger, Lori Blath, and still working at that same practice he founded so long ago. He travels every chance he can get, and was blessed with multiple grandchildren. He thought that all he wanted was to be a doctor, but it turns out being a father and a husband meant so much more to him.